Hello, everyone. Welcome to the City Parks Alliance webinar, Restoring Nature to the Urban Landscape. I'm Rebecca McMacken, and as of tomorrow, I'm going to be the former director of horticulture at Brooklyn Bridge Park. As sad as I am to leave this amazing park, I'm thrilled to go study ecological horticulture at Harvard next year, where I was awarded the Loeb Fellowship. But for today, I'll be moderating our discussion on stewarding public parks and public land for people, wildlife, and plant communities. If you're interested in continuing education credits for AICP or LACES, watch for a follow-up email in the next 2 days with instructions on how to claim your credits. For those of you that are new to City Parks Alliance, it is the only independent nationwide member organization solely dedicated to urban parks. It is a broad-based network of cross-sector park leaders focusing on the intersection between parks and other critical urban infrastructure to build equitable and healthy cities. Visit cityparksalliance.org to learn more. So, we are here today to talk about protecting, creating, and caring for quality wildlife habitat in the middle of our urban parkland and amidst the millions of people and difficult conditions that urban parks endure. Globally, half of the people on Earth currently live in cities, and that number is expected to reach 2/3 by 2050. Meanwhile, migrating birds, overwintering bumblebees, and even turtles and beavers have used this land for centuries. It's up to us to decide if our cities are going to be a hostile environment for wildlife, or if we're going to welcome these organisms to use the land that they have evolved on. City parks are in the perfect position to do this work. Collectively, we manage incredible amounts of green space in cities that can have profound effects on urban ecology. And at Brooklyn Bridge Park, we've certainly found that when a busy public park is managed for plant communities and wildlife, the park becomes a better environment for people as well. There is so much research now about the health benefits of birdsong and the sorts of connections and wonder that people experience when watching a cloud of butterflies flutter among flowers. And this is really a growing movement as more and more people recognize the benefits and importance of all of the work that we're doing. Certainly, the incredible attendance today here at this webinar is testament to that. But this sort of land management can be difficult work to do in parks, and many of us do not have the indigenous knowledge to do it. So how do we move forward? How do we learn how to steward land for wildlife in our diverse cities on limited budgets with small staffs and all of the challenges that urban parks bring? Today, we'll be talking to folks from two massive park systems who have been working on this for quite a while and are still very much in the process of learning, just as we are at Brooklyn Bridge Park. So our speakers today are joining us from Vancouver and San Francisco, and we'll be talking about the innovative work they're doing to increase the ecological value of green spaces in their cities, from converting lawns to wildflower meadows, to changing cutback methods in meadows to foster biodiversity, and determining horticulture strategies in the planning phases of park creation. We'll also hear about the collaboration between the Vancouver Park Board and First Nations communities on their meadow projects, including how valuing other aesthetics besides turf can help to decolonize green space design. With us today are Jack Tupper, landscape architect for the park development at the Vancouver Park Board, Lindsay McLean, environmental monitor in the Environmental Stewardship Department of the Musqueam Indian Band in Vancouver, and Michael Boland, Chief Park Officer at the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. We have a great turnout today, and to ensure that we respond to everyone as questions arise or if technical difficulties arise, here are some tips. To ask a question, click the questions icon on your screen, type the question in the box and click send. Feel free to send questions throughout the presentation, just know that we will be holding them until the end. If you experience a technical problem during the presentation, please type it into the questions box and send it to us. If you miss something, don't worry. Links to today's recording, the presentations, and related resources will be emailed to all registrants. Let's get started by hearing about Vancouver's Wildland Meadows project. Jack and Lindsay, you're all set to take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for being here. Lindsay and myself are here to present our experience in growing and maintaining naturalized meadows across Vancouver's urban realm and the wider region. Our intention is to transition traditional lawn sites that are underutilized into ecologically rich and biodiverse landscapes. Um, Over the last few years, since 2020, we have implemented a vast area of meadow across the city and are continuing to collect experience and data on these that we want to try and share with you now. We believe that the transparency um, of our work and the passing back and forth of information can only benefit our goals and to help create a truly sustainable and healthy future for everyone. Before we dive in, I'd like to acknowledge that I am presenting today from the lands known as Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm incredibly honored and grateful to the host nations to allow me to live here and call this place my home. So, for those of you that are away from Vancouver, a brief background of where we are. Uh, Vancouver is on the west coast of Canada in British Columbia. We're about an hour north of the US border. Metro Vancouver has around 23 cities, towns, and areas with around 2.6 million people within its limits. The city of Vancouver itself has around 650,000 people, and we are around the fourth most dense city in North America with people per kilometer. So we actually there's a lot of pressure on our park systems to try and create enough space for everybody. We have around 250 parks in our portfolio right now. And the Van Play report that was released in 2019 highlighted other neighborhoods that are in need of more access to nature. And so our portfolio is growing every year, and we hope that we can fill those gaps as soon as we can. Over the last 10 years specifically, over the last 10 years, the City of Vancouver and the Vancouver Park Board, they have created an incredible array of sustainable and progressive reports that look to improve our region's health. In 2015, I'd been living in Vancouver for a few years and I started to see the greenest city strategy develop. And that was this report that looked at making Vancouver the greenest city in the world by 2020. It had numerous facets to it that all looked at really pushing the sustainability agenda and the ecological health of our city. And two in particular that stood out to me were the Vancouver bird strategy and the urban forest strategy. The bird strategy looked at enhancing and creating new habitat for native birds and migratory birds that pass through Vancouver. And the urban forest strategy looked at planting 150,000 trees in the city to help try and bolster the city's urban canopy. And for me, there appeared to be a missing element to that, and that was simply meadows. To me, if we were to then create a meadow strategy, all of these items would be mutually beneficial, and we could create a really good sort of trifecta that would help the city become the greenest city in the world. And so in 2015, I started partnering with the City of Vancouver to look at those meadows. Now, before we get into that, there's a very brief background on what lawns are and why they have become so extensive in the Western world, essentially. So lawns essentially came around in the 16th, 17th century. They're a status symbol for wealthy landowners. The bigger the lawn, the bigger the bank account, essentially, because you would pay servants and staff to hand cut these lawns. In this era, controlling nature and a lawn outside your mansion, it was an impressive feat and brought into it a lot of influence. Now, when the lawnmower was created, it was expensive to begin with, but soon enough, everybody had access to a lawn. And because of that trickle down effect, the lawn still maintained that status symbol and that idea of cues for care. So it's whenever you see a lawn, it's an identifier that somebody's looking after that. It's green, it's healthy, it's well cared for. And that's something that we're going to keep coming back to in the naturalized meadow presentation here is cues for care. Something that keeps coming up time and time again, and it's something that we are trying to implement as well. Now, as I mentioned, in 2015, I partnered with the Vancouver Park Board and UBC to grow 20 research sites across the city and see what we could do to transition away from lawn and what alternatives there were. We looked at 4 different typologies. The first was lawn itself because we wanted to understand what the benefits were of that. The second was clover lawns, and if we need to keep the aesthetics of a lawn for sightlines, for example, could you grow a clover lawn instead? The third was a no-mow strategy. So if you completely remove the mowing regime to say once or twice per year, what happens? And then the fourth and final one was wildflower meadows. If you were to remove the lawn entirely and put 100% native wildflower seed down, what happens and what are the benefits? We implemented these meadows with a lot of community support, and we found that almost immediately there was a very positive response from members of the public. And it's something that we hope to move back to as we come out of the pandemic and into a safer space. Hopefully soon we can start collaborating with communities again to implement these meadows across the city. It creates a really good connection to the meadows for people that live in the area, and it promotes that idea of value and investment into the space. We collected data from these 20 research sites every week, and we looked at everything from bloom count, pollinator counts, the moisture content of the soils, and the temperature of the soils as well. The pollinators, we broke them down by guild because it's the simplest way to identify bees within the real world. We don't need microscopes to find the species, for example. So the guilds were essentially bumblebees, honeybees, hairy belly bees, sweat and mining bees, flies, wasps, and others such as moths, beetles, insects, and things like that. And then one of the immediate things that we had hypothesized before, but when we found with the data set, is lawns really don't offer much support for native species of pollinators. And you can see that here in these pie charts. All of the sites were predominantly blue colors, which are wasps, flies, and others. Now, there are some flies that are pollinators, but what we saw in the lawns is primarily they are not the pollinating flies. And what you can see in the center of each pie chart is the total figures are incredibly low, and usually in single figures or low teens, which over 10 weeks, this is not a good sign. You can see that the orange and yellow that appear in Fraser River Park and Jones Park, they were at moments when a weed would appear and would flower, such as hawkweed or clover. And so just by that singular flower appearing, you can see that pollinators begin to return, which is a good indication. If we go on to the next site, no-mow, for example, immediately just by removing maintenance of these lawns, you allow the plant species that are within the ground to grow and flower, and there is an instant beneficial impact to pollinating insects and the habitats that are created. Straight away, you can see there are more reds and oranges and yellows, which are those species of bees that we need to support. They are either solitary bees that we don't know how they're being impacted by climate change, or there are native bees that often live in smaller communes and we need to support them further. And you can see as well that the figures within the pie charts, they're actually much higher than the lawns just by removing maintenance. If we look at the next one, wildflower, as I mentioned, it's the most intensive approach because you have to remove the lawn entirely and place down seed, but it does have the most beneficial impacts on pollinators within our urban parks. It had dramatically higher numbers in total abundance, and it had a significant improvement to pollinator diversity as well. So if you have the time and funding, wildflowers are the best approach, but unfortunately they need to be replaced every 3 to 5 years because the wildflower species don't necessarily always reseed as they should, and it can start to dwindle over a few years. If we go just to a total tally, this one really identifies and it simply shows that the reduction in mowing allows more plants to flower. And with more flowering plants, there are more pollinators that are supported. If we really want to sustain healthier cities and biodiverse cities, we need to diversify our park landscape typologies and remove our dependence upon the lawn systems that we currently have. We need to create a patchwork of lawn systems that isn't just lawns, it isn't just meadows, but it's everything all together that can work with each other and against each other, adjacent to each other. So in 2020, when the pandemic hit Vancouver, or the world, we found that we weren't able to hire the same amount of summer staff that we usually did. And so a lot of the lawns in Vancouver, there's around 700 hectares of lawn. It needed to be adapted so that we could mow it on a reduced capacity. And what we found is, myself and my colleague Krista Voth, we wanted to look at if we could repeat that 2015 data set. What happens if we grow naturalized meadows in our parks because of the reduced manpower that we had? And we grew 14 hectares in 2020. And to simplify the process, we created these essential terminologies just here. The umbrella name for all of the meadows is a naturalized meadow. We didn't want to call it a wildflower meadow because that implies that there's a high capacity of flowering species and wildflowers, which isn't always apparent in our meadows. So naturalized meadows, which are much simpler aesthetic and ideology for people. Underneath that umbrella term, we have no-mow meadows, which is essentially no mowing regimes at all, but we spot treat any invasive plants or trees that may grow. There's then low-mow, which are sites that we mow up to twice per year, usually once in spring and then once in late summer. There are then two subcategories, which is enhanced low-mow. So it's the same aesthetic as a low-mow meadow, but we then bring in wildflower seed and overseed the site to try and increase the diversity of plant species. And then the fourth and final one is wildflower, which is that same one I spoke about earlier, which is quite intensive and needs a lot of work and funding to just get it implemented. And one of the things that we soon became apparent and understood is that the success of these meadows is based upon the operations teams that look after them. They are the teams that are on the ground and looking after these meadows and making sure that they survive and look at their best. And so what we wanted to do in 2020 when we started this project is we developed a strategy that essentially supports them, and everything that we do goes back to them, and they are in the conversations, and essentially they are at the front of everything that we are doing. We started with GIS mapping. So working with the operations teams, we looked at all of the 250 parks and we broke them down by lawn typology. There are essentially sports meadows, there's the recreational use areas, and then there's the passive use areas to the fringes of the parks and the hazardous areas that essentially not many people really use because of either slopes or adjacent to drops and stuff like that. And what we found is that those yellow areas that you can see here, the passive use areas, they became the key focus of our naturalized meadows areas because they would have the least impact on the usable park space. In 2020, we started with 14 hectares, as I mentioned, and by 2021, because of all this work that we put in with the operations teams and the mapping, we had increased that to 37.5 hectares of naturalized meadow. And this year in 2022, it has actually grown even further into 41.8 hectares. Now, this is in part of, we partnered with other departments in the city, such as engineering, who look after the road medians and boulevards. And we've created these pretty extensive naturalized meadows within key roads that bridge vast areas of the city. If we look at primarily the Vancouver Park Board's land, the one way that we can create or connect vast areas of the cities is with these boulevards. We can break those island communities that we know are negative for species because it doesn't allow travel around the city. These bridges are key to connecting many of our neighborhoods and the various parks within it. And it's one thing that we implement this year, and we're going to keep an eye on and see how they work. But it's something that we're very excited about. Again, to help the operations teams, we created these cut sheets that are very simple two-sided pieces of paper that just break down each of the management strategies. It gives very brief or key information that's needed, the definitions, how to maintain them, and schedules and when to maintain them. It gives key facts as well, so if any members of the public approach them, they have all the information that they need to give back. And we also created these design and layout templates that they give a very good understanding on those cues for care that I mentioned earlier on. How do we make these meadows look intentional? How do we make them look like they are maintained properly? And I'll recommend that everybody goes and reads John Nassauer's Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. It's an incredible report or article that summarizes this meadow strategy and how to make it look intentional and maintained and beautiful. One of the things that we found as well, there's a lot of perceived hazards with naturalized meadows. there's a lot of perceived risks and concerns, particularly when it comes to changing somebody's valued park space into a different typology. And we wanted to implement this hazard response plan that essentially avoids any knee-jerk reactions, but gives us a strategy of how to respond to perceived risks. The first one is phase one is we maintain the meadow as normal. We maintain it as normal. We monitor it as we go, and it's just keep an eye on it as you would a regular meadow. If there's any perceived risks that appear, we then move into phase two. Now, phase two, we widen the boundaries and we mow a wider perimeter of around 3 meters. We widen the trails that are through the meadows to create a bigger break between them, and we widen the mowing edges away from infrastructure, utilities, buildings, for example. And we also monitor them on an increased basis. If the perceived risk is still there, and it's as we did in 2020 2021 with the heat dome in BC, we move into phase three. And unfortunately, that means that we have to mow down all of the meadows because the risk is still there and we can't necessarily avoid, or we don't want to risk like going any further. So this is a good strategy of how to break down the hazard response plan. The author of, I just saw a comment, the author of the report that I mentioned a moment ago is Joan Nassauer. I think that's how you pronounce her surname. It's Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. So we repeated the same data set from 2015, and we wanted to look at what these no-mow meadows do for our city. And we found that it's essentially the same results as 2015, which is very good for us. So in both 2020 and 2021, we found that just by removing the mowing strategy, there's a dramatic increase in pollinator and bloom count. And similarly, there's also a decrease in temperature and an increase in moisture. You can see here that the black dashed line is the lawns, and in all instances, the meadows fared better. As well as this data set from 2015, we are trying to go further to understand other elements of the site. We're looking at the microbial communities and the soil health that's beneath the meadows and what our meadows do to improve those. We're looking at bat surveys across the city and seeing at how they can all work together with bat populations, tree communities, and meadow areas, simply because we think there may be more insects to feed the bats. And then similarly, we're also doing bird analysis. We also partnered with a student, Jens Ulrich at UBC, who did a PhD study on our meadows and found that in all of the parks that had the naturalized meadows, there were instances of very rare bees that are rarely seen in our city. In the parks that didn't have meadows, these bees weren't present, which means that the meadows, as simple as they are to implement, they are supporting a species and an array of bees that we don't typically see in our city, which can only really be a good thing. And now I think I'm now going to hand over to Lindsay McLean to discuss the Musqueam Park Meadow project. Lindsay.
Thanks, Jack. So today I'll be sharing a bit about the Musqueam Park Meadow project, how it came to be, and the internal processes required for anyone in our First Nation community trying to get a project like this started. Earlier this year, I attended a similar webinar to the one we're presenting today. Following the presentation, I reached out to ask if Musqueam Park was considered during their pilot program. Musqueam Park is just on the outskirts of our community and is frequented by many members, including myself, for leisure and cultural activities. Restoring the local biodiversity is important for everyone, and after hearing of Jack's research and data, I thought that piggybacking on this program sounded like a great step in the right direction. Vancouver Parks responded, informing us that Musqueam Park has not yet been considered for this program, but they were interested in collaborating if there's an opportunity. Next slide, please. So for projects like this, consensus decision-making is needed when work is in our traditional territories. After receiving and presenting the program proposal, we received approval to collaborate and were advised to keep administration informed each step of the way. To date, we are still in the process of the consensus decision-making of the site selection, seeking approval from the Title and Rights Secretariat, which includes leadership from various departments. Additionally, we are seeking approval from knowledge keepers and decision makers within the community. We must address all comments and concerns and receive approval from all consulted before we move forward. This step should be completed soon, then we can move to the planting plan, planting, and monitoring. Next slide, please. So the Musqueam Environmental Stewardship Department team worked to choose potential sites to bring forward. A total of 6 were chosen, indicated here with the pink polygons. These will be narrowed down to 2 final sites when our internal consultation with decision makers and administration leadership is complete. When our 2 sites are finalized, we will then share these with Vancouver Parks, who will work with their teams to check that the sites are appropriate on their end. The sites were chosen based on usage of locations, sunlight exposure, soil moisture, and potential for increased community enjoyment. Next slide, please. So the next steps. Seeking feedback will be required for every step of the way, some steps needing more consultation than others. The planting plan will be created by Musqueam Environmental Stewardship Department. Once completed, it will be shared with Vancouver Parks for review and implementation. The plan requires consultation with the same administrative authorities, knowledge keepers, and also the community. With this opportunity for introducing culturally significant native species into the area, it's important that we involve as much of the community as possible to determine what should be priority. For monitoring and research, we hope to have the capacity to help Vancouver Parks with some of their post-planting surveys. And we would also do our own monitoring to provide updates of observations to the interested members of the community and administration. This collaboration between Musqueam Environmental Stewardship Department and Vancouver Parks on the Meadows project allows us to make decisions in our territory and is a great first step in appropriate First Nation consultation. This project also opened up the floor for better communication between the 2 entities and resulted in us being engaged in additional projects within the park. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us today. I'll pass it back to Jack to briefly go over some resources.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, really, thank you all for being here. In our experience so far, like the keys to success that we are finding is really those cues for care. If you can maintain the meadows in an aesthetic manner with clean edges and pathways through to allow people to really interact with the meadow so it doesn't feel off limit, they are essentially what we're finding as successful elements to the meadows. And working with the operations teams and other departments, other governmental bodies, just working with anybody you can to try and share the information and come together on these meadows, they're essentially how we're finding this success in these meadows, and hopefully will do into the future. That's essentially our presentation, and I thank you all for watching. I'll hand back to Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Jack and Lindsay. I really loved the combination of scientific and community approaches. It was wonderful. Now we'll hear from Michael about the work he and his team are doing to increase native habitat and improve the ecological health of the historic Presidio. Take it away, Michael.
Awesome, thank you. It's great to be here with everyone today to talk a little bit about the Presidio of San Francisco. All right, so the Presidio of San Francisco was the traditional homeland of the Yelamu. And the Yelamu were a local tribe of the Ramaytush Ohlone people. And that changed radically in 1776 when the Spanish established a garrison or Presidio to guard the entrance to San Francisco Bay and began the systematic colonization and eradication of the Yelama. It also began about 220 years of military use of the site. And that the site was used first by the Spanish and then by the Mexican government and then the American military. That history has left a really complicated collection of historic buildings and historic landscapes from the various periods of development. And because of that really important history, in 1962, the entire site was established as a National Historic Landmark District. And then in 1972, when the Golden Gate National Recreation Area was created, it was included within the legislative boundaries of that new urban national park site. In 1989, the United States Army decided that they no longer needed the Presidio to defend the country, and so they determined that they were going to leave the Presidio. And in 1994, they left, and the land transferred to the National Park Service. Unfortunately, what they left was an Army base that had decades of deferred maintenance, and 800 derelict buildings, a 300-acre dying historic forest, and a whole array of derelict historic landscapes, because there had been a pattern of decades of underinvestment. And this was a significant challenge. So in 1997, the United States Congress created a new kind of partnership park model. They set up a new kind of partnership between a new type of federal agency, the Presidio Trust, and the National Park Service to manage and steward the Presidio in perpetuity for the American public. Congress included a very unique requirement, and the requirement is that we had 15 years to become financially self-sufficient. Now that's important for our story, because what that meant is that the Presidio not only had to be a national park, it had to be a business. And the primary way that we could generate revenue to support the park was by rehabilitating all of the buildings that the Army had left us, to create a new kind of national park community of 3,500 people living in the park and about 4,000 people working in the park. Now, interestingly enough, although the Army repeatedly redeveloped the Presidio to serve the changing needs of the nation as the requirements of defending our country changed, they never developed about 7% of the site, and those are these small relic areas that are shown here. So, and these natural areas are really unique because they preserve the best remaining collection of San Francisco's native biodiversity. And the richness, the biological richness of these small relic natural areas is really quite profound. In fact, the Presidio has a greater density of special status plant species per acre than any other national park site in the United States. We have 21 special status plant species in our 1,500 acres. So it's a really unusual site insofar as, though it was saved primarily for its historic resource values, it's actually a biodiversity hotspot set in the middle of this derelict, or when we got it at least, derelict Army infrastructure. So the challenge we had to wrestle with was a simple but not so simple one. Namely, how do we restore the biodiversity of a heavily visited heritage site like the Presidio, and also a site that has to generate enough revenue each year in order to support itself at no cost to the American taxpayer. We quickly realized that we had to get to work, and we had to do a couple of things. And the first thing I want to talk about is we had to change our perspective, because like most national park sites, we had inherited an incredible legacy of conservation and stewardship practices and policies, and those worked really well in a wilderness setting, but they were really based on this notion of a dichotomy between people and nature. And here we had a site where people were essential to the place, and so those strategies didn't really have much value for us. Nevertheless, we began our work, and we focused our activities on the stewardship of those relic natural areas, because they had been heavily impacted over the years by Army activities and also by the visiting public. Because the Presidio, unlike most national parks, or excuse me, most Army bases, was actually an open Army base. So it had been used by the public for over 100 years. So we began by experimenting with a whole host of management strategies, many of which were really developed in wilder areas, trying to test them to understand their applicability. But also, because we had so few resources, we had to use volunteers. And the use of volunteers ended up becoming a really important and fundamental aspect of our stewardship program. We really focused on community stewardship as a strategy for restoring these natural areas. And what's interesting is we succeeded in arresting the impacts to those relic natural areas, but the impacts just kept coming. We kept getting invasive exotics coming in from the adjacent historic Army gardens. The sites kept getting trampled unwittingly by park visitors and their pets. And what we realized is that it was impossible for us to focus only on the relic natural areas to save these important natural systems, but that what we really needed to do was to shift our perspective. And we needed to get out of this dichotomized worldview where we thought of people as the problem and really shifted to thinking of people as the solution. and particularly important element of the solution to preserving native ecosystems or natural systems in the middle of cities. So we needed to really change our perspective, and we needed to reimagine the primeval, this notion of the primeval that has persisted for so long, and really humanize the primeval, reintegrate people into the natural world, both in our minds and in our philosophy, but also in the strategies that we were using to steward these natural ecosystems. We had to get out of that nature-culture divide that we've talked about, and I bring it up only because even though we are in the Anthropocene, solidly in the Anthropocene, and we talk a lot about the fact that we've moved beyond this dichotomy, the fact is it still informs the work of so many landscape architects and restoration ecologists and park managers and the thinking of the general public today. So I think it's important that we always come back to this notion and the need for us to get beyond it. And what we realized is that we needed to really develop an expanded field of natures. We needed to tease apart the sort of aesthetic and functional considerations of nature from the ecological values of the landscapes, and really develop an expanded field of ways for thinking about nature in a place like the Presidio. We adopted a series of human-centered restoration philosophies. I was happy to hear mention of cues for care, this notion that we need to restore our natural areas in a way that makes people understand that they're cared for. And that very much built into our human-centered restoration philosophy, that we're always thinking about not only improving the health of our ecosystems, but also improving the visitor experience and the human experience as well, even in our natural areas of the park. We developed a new vision for the Presidio, one that looked holistically at the Presidio's three landscapes, the historic forest areas, the design landscapes, as well as the natural areas, to try to think of it as an ecological whole, and set a series of goals for ourselves about expanding the footprint of natural area in the park, daylighting streams that the Army had buried, restoring a series of fragile and heavily impacted riparian ecosystems in the park, improving greater connectivity between this relic natural areas, and doing all of this in a way that preserved the National Historic Landscape District, Landmark District, what was important about it from a historic preservation perspective. So I wanted to just give you a couple of examples of how this has played itself out. One of those is in the restoration of Mountain Lake, which Mountain Lake is the only remaining natural lake in the Presidio. And as you can see with this from this photo, one that's heavily impacted by the adjacent urban areas. When the lake transferred over from the Army to the park, the lake was slowly dying. We saw accelerating sedimentation. There were heavy nutrient loads. The lake was overwhelmed by exotic fish. Every summer we had horrible fish kills, and there was heavy metal contamination at the bottom of the lake. So it was kind of a little shop of horrors series of things going on in the lake. We began by deeply working with the community to try to understand both their relationship to the place, but also try to understand the root cause of some of the environmental degradation. We discovered some fascinating things. For example, a really positive impulse in the minds of the community because they loved the lake. And they loved the lake so much they thought it would be a great place for them to release all of their pets, for example. And so we had this ongoing issue with people releasing their pets into the lake, and those pets then going on, because they were invasive exotic species, going on to destroy the health of the lake. So we began a series of experiments, experimenting with a pledge, for example, for young people in the community, getting them to commit to preserving the health of Mountain Lake. We also developed a pet amnesty box where people in the surrounding neighborhood, when they had a spare goldfish or a spare turtle that they no longer wanted to have as a pet, could leave and that we would find good homes for. Looking for a series of strategies that would actually effectively mitigate the impact of the surrounding community on the health of the lake. We also adopted a strategy of strategic sequencing. Because we had to build a lot of trust with the surrounding community, we decided that it was important that we start with the easy things. And luckily, there were a lot of easy things to start with because there was so much derelict land that was in and around the Mountain Lake site, including this former pump station that the Army used to use to pump water out of the lake. So we worked with the community to reimagine these sites in a more ecological way. And we put off some of the tougher things. Things like removing the invasive exotic fish and turtles from the lake, or removing the invasive Tasmanian blue gum forests that surrounded the lake and were polluting the water. We put off those things until we developed the kind of trust and the working relationship with the community that would allow us to take on those things. And then we adopted an approach of, I like to think of as radical transparency, where we overshared about these things. We overshared about the risks because we believed that it was vitally important that the public absolutely trust these things that we were doing, these strategies that are more often used in wilderness areas, applying those in cities so that they supported the work that we were doing. In the case of Mountain Lake, it really worked. We've removed in the course of over the last decade, 45,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment to deepen the lake and remove heavy metals. We've removed all of the exotic blue gum woodlands around the fringes of the lake. We've removed all of the exotic fish and all of the exotic turtles. We moved them to a reptile rescue up in Sonoma County. They're living happily on a series of vineyard ponds up there. Reintroduced a whole series of native fish and invertebrates, as well as the threatened western pond turtle into the lake. And just last year, we had the first crop of new western pond turtles that were actually bred in the lake. And lastly, all of the water quality indicators that we set, all the targets that we set for ourselves in this project have been met. So a really great outcome for Mountain Lake. Probably most importantly, the community understands the lake and the ecology of the lake and feels an enormous sense of pride about their role in the restoration of the lake. But because we've been capital constrained and because of our financial self-sufficiency mandate, we've had to be pretty scrappy and entrepreneurial in our approach to the restoration of the natural ecosystems in the park. A couple more quick examples. One of the things we did early in the history of the Presidio was to negotiate a transfer of responsibility from the United States Army to the Trust for all of the environmental cleanup. That allowed us to remove 13 Army landfills and to use that as a strategy for restoring native ecosystems, because many of those Army landfills were built over the top of creeks. The Army would bury those creeks in pipes and then use the riparian corridors as dumping grounds. So by cleaning those up, we not only created a healthier landscape, we also were able to restore some of the natural ecosystems of the park. We also had the opportunity in the reconstruction of Doyle Drive, the freeway that connects San Francisco to the Golden Gate Bridge, to not only improve the freeway as a result of the Loma Prieta earthquake to make it more earthquake safe, but because the new freeway was going to be twice as wide, we used that as an opportunity to negotiate a transfer of mitigation with the state of California that turned this paved area shown here into a 9-acre new marsh. We worked with California College of Arts and Crafts to develop a oyster habitat pilot that would allow us to improve the habitat of the culverts that we're going to use to move the water under the freeway. And that has resulted in 9 acres of new brackish marsh connecting the Crissy Field Marsh and the Tennessee Hollow watershed. The return of a whole array of inverts and fish into that ecosystem, as well as a really interesting oyster pilot that is serving as a breeding ground for the native Olympia oyster, which we are trying to restore all over San Francisco Bay. And we hope if this pilot is successful that we can apply it, we can share the results, and it can be a model for how to restore the entire seawall along the edge of downtown San Francisco. But with all of that, we still had a challenge, the remaining challenge. And that was really had to do with the spillover effects from the design landscapes and the historic forest on the natural areas, because the site is still fundamentally a historic landscape. And those design landscapes and historic forests, invasive exotics would spill over from those areas. Members of the public were trampling from those areas. And so we really needed to focus our energy as much on the historic landscape of the Presidio as on those restored natural areas. We needed to come up with strategies for rewilding what is really the matrix of the entire Presidio. As I mentioned before, the Presidio really is a landscape that's dominated by humans. Not only the 3,500 people that live there and the 4,000 people that work there, but the more than 10 million people a year that visit the 1,500-acre site each year. We began our reconsideration of the matrix by looking at the pre-European ecology of the entire site. We tried to reconstruct it using a whole array of sources, including historic plant collections and early site surveys, historic site descriptions, and a series of nearby reference sites. We used that historical ecology to create a comprehensive framework for integrating ecology into the design and maintenance of our historic landscapes. And based on that, we developed a whole series of new historic garden archetypes. So new garden archetypes for historic foundation plantings, new garden archetypes for how to think about lawns, so that we're both preserving, while we're preserving the what is character defining about those landscapes, we're improving the environmental performance of all of those landscapes as well. We also developed a system for evaluating the potential invasiveness of garden plants to make sure that we weren't inadvertently reintroducing species that would extend or would invade and transfer out into the adjacent natural areas. We combined our habitat restoration and our horticulture teams so that we created a new integrated landscape stewardship program that brought the strengths of each of those traditions together into an integrated approach to the stewardship of the entire Presidio landscape. And together, those two teams worked together to develop and implement a whole array of ecological horticulture practices that really built on both of those traditions. Things like bird nesting season, prohibitions on vegetation removal, cessation of deadheading of species so that the seeds remain for birds and other animals to eat, leaving areas of bare soil for insects and birds. And we also implemented a series of prohibitions on the residents and tenants, the people that lived and worked in the park, to make sure that their activities in the design landscape weren't having a negative impact on the ecology of Presidio. We implemented a new urban wildlife research program so that we could understand the life ways of urban coyotes, for example, or understand the ways that we could modify the historic forest vegetation, the eucalyptus trees in particular, to support migrating monarch butterflies every year. Now, as a result of these three strategies, we've had really significant, really positive results. Between 1997, we've increased the acreage of natural area in the Presidio from 23 acres to 113 acres. We've seen really exponential increases in the populations of the park's special status plant species. For example, when we started, we had less than 50 Presidio clarkia plants in the park, and now we have about 40,000. We had less than 50,000 San Francisco Lysingea plants in the park, less than 50 plants, and we have now over 200,000. And we've also been able to reintroduce a whole dozens of plant and animal species. I mentioned earlier the pond turtle. We're currently working on plans to reintroduce our state bird, the California quail. Now, all of that happened during the same time that visitation grew from just a handful of neighbors who came each year to over 10 million visitors a year. But really, those three strategies are not really enough to sustain the Presidio in perpetuity, its ecological systems in perpetuity. So the fourth strategy that we've really focused on has to do with building future stewards, building that next generation of individuals that will be able to carry forward this good work into the future. The Presidio, like so many parks, we've utilized technology to try to engage the community and transform them into citizen scientists and stewards of the Presidio with great success. But what we found is that even those strategies were not really reaching everyone. And so we began a program of differentially investing in urban kids, particularly young people from families that historically have been underrepresented in national parks, prioritizing low-income youth and also children of color to make sure that everybody in our community actually had access to the programs in the park. But one of the challenges we faced early on was that there were limits on the number of young people that could be served within the acreage of natural area that we had. And so we realized that we had to take these programs to scale in order to make sure that everybody in our community could actually be served. And so we've just recently opened a new park, the Presidio Tunnel Tops. It's 14 acres of new park built over the freeway to connect the heart of the Presidio to the northern waterfront. And the Tunnel Tops is a project that was designed with community. Over 10,000 members of the public participated in the process, and really designed for community, and particularly designed to welcome communities that historically have not felt welcome in national parks, or nor felt like they had access to national parks. At the heart of the Tunnel Tops are a series of new facilities, a new youth campus that are really designed to be a stewardship engine. They include things like an outdoor nature environment called the Outpost, a new environmental education space called the Field Station, as well as the Chrissy Field Center, which is a deep engagement facility serving youth. These three facilities together really constitute a stewardship engine, an engine that we can use to both connect every child in our community with nature and with the outdoors, give them the tools that they need to be able to understand nature and the outdoors. And we hope that some subset of those young people will go on to become part of that next generation of stewards that we all need in order to be sure that all of the good work that we're doing these days in bringing nature and preserving nature in cities can actually grow and flourish in the 21st century. So in summary, I just want to leave you with three key takeaways, three things that have been really fundamental to our success at the Presidio. The first is that it's vitally important, if we want to preserve biodiversity in cities, it's vitally important that we think about nature in a new way, and that we really think of this expanded field of natures. The second is that we have to move out of this 19th century mindset, holistically out of it, but comprehensively out of it, and begin to think of people as the solution, not the problem, to preserving biodiversity in cities. And frankly, this last thought, I know we all know, but I think we often don't spend enough time focused on it, which is that all of our fine work is wasted unless we build future stewards for our planet, and that we should be devoting as much energy to building those stewards as we are to preserving the ecosystems in the first place. Thank you for your kind attention today.
Thanks so much, Michael. What an incredible success story. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of the presentation, but I just want to quickly remind everyone that the presentations and the slides and all of the resources that we're talking about are going to be sent out via email from the City Parks Alliance after the lecture, so don't worry about it. So to kick off the Q&A, I've got a question of my own. The three of you just showed us small slices of all of the incredible work that you're doing. But this was just a 1-hour webinar, and there's so much more information that I know people want to learn from you. Certainly, the Q&A are almost entirely requests for details and management plans and cut sheets to learn how to do this work, which can be really hard to find. At Brooklyn Bridge Park, we are always thinking about how to share the techniques and methodologies that we've developed with a wider audience. And to that end, I'd like to plug our Hort Resources webpage, which has guides to mulching and databases of native plants for urban conditions. And you can also sign up for my monthly newsletter on ecological horticulture. But outside of online resources and gatherings like this, what are the other ways that you think that we as a community of landscapes with such similar goals could be organizing to push this movement forward for everyone?
Well, I'll just say I love your website, and I also love your mailings. I get them and read them religiously. So +1, everybody sign up for your stuff. So that's the first thing I'd say. You know, honestly, I believe that in seeing, and I think the best thing we can possibly be doing is making ourselves as available as possible in the places that we are managing, because there's no shortage of that. And I know that when I travel, it's often really difficult to find who the right person is to call. And I think that even if we all simply did that, like who is the right person to call at every park, in a major park doing this work, and posted those numbers in a really, in a consolidated place, maybe the City Parks Alliance could take the lead on that. That would be an incredible resource.
Agreed.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say as well. Just being able to talk to people. You can go away and read and research as much as you can, but just asking somebody in the adjacent city or another town, it's so much easier because they have all the experience and the knowledge that you may need. And that's partly why I'm sure we've all mentioned this, like just sharing as much information as possible, making everything transparent. Yeah, that's the only way.
It really seems like those of us who have done it before are like really trying to figure out how to share it with people who want to do it. And it's like, it's forums like this that really make that possible. So thank you to City Parks Alliance for putting this on. This next question is for you, Jack. There were a lot of questions about specific data collection methods you used for tracking bees and birds. Maybe you can follow up with something, or maybe you could address it here.
Yeah, given that we only had such a short time, I couldn't go into too much detail, but essentially each of the meadows was a certain dimension, and then we chose 1 meter quadrants from within that meadow, and then spent 5 minutes counting the pollinators that visited the quadrants, and then also afterwards we would count how many flowers were seen. And now counting the flowers was a very rough estimate because sometimes there were hundreds, so you'd have to try and use a ballpark figure. But we then also used I forget the term, but I can find it afterwards. We had a soil probe that would just measure temperature, moisture content, and light content. So all of these different things we would use every single week, and over time it just built a nice picture. Now we then assessed all that data in 7 years ago, so my brain's not too powerful right now, but it was in like a jump software to do, I think it was called Nova tests. There's all these tests that you need to do to assess whether the data is statistically accurate or if there's enough of a significance for it to be proven to be true. And we had to do all of that at the time, and we found that the meadows, each of the meadows, clover, nomo, and wildflower, had significant improvements.
Very cool. Thanks for that. This next question is really for everyone, and it's about communication. And I think, you know, you all had such interesting methods of communicating your work to the public, if it's via signage, if it's via education. And so maybe you could just take a minute to talk about, you know, what is too much communication? What is the right amount of communication? What have you seen work? And like what potential new strategies for communication you could think to try?
Well, I'm happy to share. It's such a challenge these days, right? We're all overwhelmed with communication, but we do everything from social media to on-site signage to on-site events, using baby turtles as a kind of charismatic microfauna. I think that it's got to be an all of the above and a mix between sort of digital technology, but also traditional communication. We have site stewards on all of our sites that are working directly with members of the public that are coming to the site and getting them excited. So I think it's an all of the above approach.
Yeah, I completely agree. Every single aspect that you can do for sharing information to the public is useful. We are finding that when public give feedback, it's generally because they've got a concern or there's something that they want to address. It's very rarely they submit an email or a query because it's something positive. We do get those, but it's usually because there's a concern. So we're finding that social media is a good opportunity to provide positive feedback because people take photos of things that they like, and then if you can tag, say, Vancouver Meadows, it then promotes positive feedback. And I think that's what we're trying to use right now. We get the negative feedback via email coordination, but then we might get the positive stuff by Instagram and Facebook. And that's a good one for us at the moment.
That's wonderful. Lindsay, do you have any planned communication strategies yet, or is it still early in the process?
For our project, it's quite early in the process, but yeah, it's just complete transparency with the community, and yeah.
Wonderful. Cool. All right. So in the interest of time, unfortunately, that was our last question. I know that there's been so many questions, and maybe we can do some follow-up over email with all of this. But just a reminder that the links to today's recording, the presentations, and related resources will be emailed to all registrants within 2 business days. Also, please take a minute to fill out the short evaluation that will pop up after the session concludes. I'd like to thank our presenters for joining us today and sharing the great work they're doing to foster biodiversity in urban areas for the benefit of animals, people, and the planet. We hope you will use this information as you work to create and increase the ecological value of green spaces in your community. If you have additional questions for me or the speakers, you can reach us directly at the emails shown on the screen. Please visit the events tab at cityparksalliance.org for information about upcoming webinars and other events. Members can also access the full webinar archive. If you're interested in becoming a City Parks Alliance member, please visit cityparksalliance.org/join for information about all of CPA's great member benefits, including workshops, members-only webinars, and peer conversations, park study tours, and more. And last but not least, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. Keep up the great work you're doing in our urban parks. Thanks, everyone.